On behalf of the Shadow Open Market Committee, I would like to welcome you to this special meeting dedicated to Marvin Goodfriend and his significant influences on monetary policy. Before getting started, I would like to thank the Manhattan Institute for sponsoring the Shadow Open Market Committee, and Rehan Salam, the president of MI, and MI's extraordinarily capable events and communications teams for helping put this together. I would also like to recognize special guests, Marcia Goodfriend-Schuler, and Marvin's wife, of course, and former Director of Communications at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And Marvin's sister, Miriam's going to be coming along, and also his nieces. So when touch of history, when Marvin left the Richmond Fed for Carnegie Mellon, it took a surprising amount of arm twisting to get Marvin to join the Shadow Open Market Committee. He knew all of the research that was being conducted. A number of us made calls to him and twisted his arm, and he actually led us to change some of our operating procedures in order to agree to come on. Bob, I see you're laughing. And then he agreed, saying, this is going to be a big commitment. And he met that commitment. He wrote a paper for every one of our semi-annual meetings. They were all serious and provocative papers on position papers that were, critical to the Fed. So Marvin, as you know, he contributes. So he contributed in many other ways, helping to set the focus of the meetings, and he helped the SOMC develop its core beliefs, a set of guiding principles for monetary policy. And as you would expect, one of his key beliefs was the benefits of rules-based guidelines in the conduct of monetary policy. Now, in this regard, I must note that Marcia, Marvin's mother and sister, attended virtually every SOMC meeting. And recently, Marcia provided me insight into how Marvin was consistent in theory and in practice. He allowed his mother to attend the meetings as long as she followed certain rules. And maybe that's one of the reasons why she just smiled broadly during Marvin's presentations, but never asked him any questions. And I must note, on a personal basis, I benefited from many discussions with Marvin, whether it was on the phone, dinners, or taking walks through Pittsburgh, and I continue to reflect on him. But after Marvin passed away, the SOMC, we quickly looked through the SOMC website and put together a list of all of his papers, and all of the panels from today's meeting fell directly out of all of his research focuses: transparency and communications, inflation targeting and rules-based policies, monetary policy in the zero lower bound, and then the Fed's balance sheet and credit policy. So what we did then is we approached a number of current and former Fed members and researchers whose tenures overlapped with Marvin's about the possibility of coming to a meeting and dedicated to his work. And all I can say is, Marvin, would have been smiling about the unanimous response, the lineup of today's speakers, and of course the timeliness of the topics. So, Andy, why don't you come up and introduce Bob?
Well, welcome, everyone. We really appreciate this opportunity to pay tribute to Marvin. He was a really remarkable economist and remarkable person. I'm sure we'll hear a lot about that today, but there's really no one I can think of who's more qualified to talk about Marvin's scholarly contributions than Professor Robert King of Boston University. I'm just going to point out one joint contribution the two of them made together that was very influential for my own thinking, and I think many of my colleagues. And that was we call it Goodfriend and King, 1997 macro annual. I almost know the paper by heart. We studied it so carefully. If you can imagine, at that time, this was just like a bolt of lightning out of the blue. In that paper, they talked about how monetary policy could be evaluated in ways similar to other kinds of public policies to try to think about costs and benefits to consumers and businesses in an economy with staggered price setting, very precise, careful derivations of very compelling, clear results. The foundational result of that paper was the importance for the central bank of providing a stable unit of account. And I think that's an old idea, but they presented that and proved it mathematically, rigorously, in a really compelling way that's, I think, had very lasting influence ever since. So with that, let me introduce Professor King to give us more insights. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm very glad to be here as part of remembering Marvin Goodfriend, who was really one of the preeminent monetary economists and macroeconomists of our time. Now, I will confess in advance that I may be challenged emotionally during this presentation because Marvin and I were very close in ways that I'll talk about. It's also the case that there's some distributed material, and it's kind of in the character of classes that I teach, which is I wind up producing far too many slides to actually go into the allotted time. I distribute the slides, and then sometimes I do a video recording to cover the additional material so that the students, if they're studying for the exam at the last minute, can go deeper into things. And so, in fact, my plan with respect to these slides is to produce a series of videos on components of them so that the presentation I'm making to this group can be accessed more broadly. Now, Marvin wrote an amazing number of influential papers. And so the task that I was confronted with is, well, what am I going to do? How can I conceivably talk about all of this? And how can I simultaneously talk about the scholar and the close friend? So what I decided to do was to stop in 1993, talk about Marvin's work up to that point, talk about various aspects of our personal interactions. And so I'm kind of a transition between last night's stories and today's harder analysis that will follow in the other presentations. That means I'm not going to talk about the paper that Andy just mentioned, or indeed, if one looks at Marvin's most cited papers, the last 8 papers on the list. So I'm going to just talk about four papers that had, I think, a profound effect on me and on many in the monetary policy community. But channeling Marvin, at the end, after doing a review, I'm going to try to connect up some of the lessons from this review of papers to current events. And as I said, I've got far too much stuff. So if you're following along in the slides, I'm going to be skipping things regularly. In particular, I'm going to skip the first couple of pages where I list papers that I'm going to review here, and then some that I'm going to review around the time of a second memorial in Pittsburgh in June. Now, I want to go back to when I first met Marvin in the way that John McDermott did last night. We were quasi-classmates at Brown. And by that I mean I was coming in from a checkered undergraduate education, and I had a lot to learn. And Marvin was incredibly influential for me in terms of making the transition to being an academic. Now, Herschel Grossman was one of the major influences for Marvin and me. Many of you may not know that Marvin and I were trained as disequilibrium macroeconomists. But it was a particular style of disequilibrium macroeconomics that stressed the importance of precision in theory. And then Herschel followed that up with analysis, teaching us contracting theory. And he had strong views on how macroeconomics should be done, in particular he wasn't much a fan of the kind of information-based models that Lucas and Barrow were working on at the time. And nevertheless, he was willing to talk to me about it in terms of thesis material. The thing I remember most about Herschel was the phrase, "Why don't you read this?" And there would be paper, and come talk to me. And he did that repeatedly with Marvin and me across a wide range of things. And so at the end of a really difficult first year, we sort of figured, well, this macro is hard, but we're getting a handle on it. And then Bill Poole showed up. And Poole's second-year macro monetary course was completely different. I mean, there were Fisherian perspectives and discussions of the monetarist controversy. Poole taught us the permanent income theory as an empirical, a wonderful blending of empirics and theory, stressing micro and macro implications. He taught us efficient markets with work by Fama on stocks, but particularly with Roll on the term structure. Taught us rational expectations in the Lucas critique, commercial bank reserve management, optimal monetary policy, optimal monetary instrument along the lines of his QJE paper, and then the challenges that had arisen to that analysis in the work of Sargent and Wallace. I mean, looking back, we were unbelievably lucky that that was the template for Bill's course. And boy, did it open our eyes and make us realize we had lots to learn. We also, in that course, met another friend. There was a kind of fuzzy-haired undergraduate with Coke bottle glasses sitting in on the course. That was Douglas Diamond, who we then spent lots of time with in Richmond when he joined the advisory staff there. For Marvin, in addition to Poole and Grossman tugging us in these disparate directions, there was George Bortz, who was Marvin's thesis advisor. And Bortz was at the time editing the American Economic Review. He was a strong proponent of price theory in the Chicago style, and told me once that he had sat in on Stigler's price theory 4 times, and he learned something every time. One of the things he learned is that the jokes never changed. Bortz had the view that everything was trade, and in ways that are going to sound quaint to you, Bortz paid Marvin and me to read and check the math in forthcoming AER papers among a pool of other graduate students. And what an opportunity that was, to get to look at what was going on in the profession and look at it close and get paid for it. It was almost as good as working at the swimming pool. Anyway. So now I want to talk a little bit about Marvin as a person. And when I attended his funeral in December and went to the, I think it's a Shiva afterwards, I spoke with one of Marvin's relatives, and they asked me how I knew him. I said I'd known him since graduate school, and we'd spent a lot of time together, written some papers. And the person came back to me in a kind of clipped New York accent and said, "Oh, then he was more like a brother." I warned you. So he was more like a brother. He was an intense guy. We had intense discussions about all sorts of stuff. We had comprehensive notebooks that we would write stuff in and then we would argue about. We went on many long walks, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's a theme that's been emerging in this conference about people taking walks with Marvin and talking about economics. Marvin and I also prowled bookstores for old books, and that was a competitive sport with Marvin, because he was always better at finding the good books than I was. Marvin was trained in math at Union College and had an incredible appreciation for mathematics. He also was a great musician. People have talked about that before, something that he shared with another SOMC person and close friend of his, Ben McCallum. Now, that was something where I could only, with my teen ear, I could only appreciate and not contribute to. I want to talk a little bit about Marvin and the evolution of research departments inside the Federal Reserve System. I think the period between 1978 and 1988, say, was an interval in which many of the regional banks were seeking to upgrade their analytical groups, And Marvin was an example of somebody who could do things in ways that the academic community would appreciate and that was directly policy relevant. And so he was both an example of what you could have in your research department if you did a good job in hiring people, and he was an inspiration, I believe, to many younger Fed economists about paths that they could take. He was in some ways a mentor, a little bit like having an older uncle who knew things better than you at times, but a mentor nevertheless. And I think there's no question that he was an intellectual leader. During that time when I would visit various Federal Reserve banks, Dale Henderson once described me as an itinerant Federal Reserve visitor, people would ask me, how did he do it in Richmond? And this was directors of research, staff, and others. And I think there's no question that Richmond was a template. Then, after graduate school, Marvin moved to Richmond, and that was a perfect fit. You had Bob Black, who stood fair square for price stability, guys like Jim Parthemus and Al Broadus, who stood for high-quality policy-relevant research, Bob Hetzel, who was upgrading the recruiting efforts of the Richmond Bank and was probably primarily responsible for hiring Marvin. And it was an incredibly horizontal culture. The president had an office upstairs, but you would see the president on the floor and at lunch. There was an active lunch table. My mother once asked me, what is your job in Richmond? And I said, my job is to go to lunch. And she said, how does that work? Well, there would be a big circular table, and somebody would come through with a question, the research director, or Bob Hetzel, or Marvin, and then there would be a seminar around the table that would continue frequently for the rest of the day. Now, at one stage, it was feasible for consultants to attend part of the pre-SOMC meetings in Richmond, and I don't think there was any better statement of the philosophy of the Richmond Bank at the time than something I remember Bob Black saying in a meeting when a fairly abstract point had been made by a member of his staff. Now, to be clear, I'm going to take some journalistic license here, and I'm going to make up the words that Bob Black said. I didn't write them down at the time, but the message was really clear. He said, I agree with you about this, but it's too complicated for me to bring to an FOMC meeting. I need you to advocate to his staff for the Richmond view to the board's economists by writing papers that they want and need to read. Then they will explain the idea to the board's members so that when I give a short description in an FOMC meeting, everyone will understand. And what a charge that was to the research department, and one that I think Marvin executed admirably, but he also grew up a whole younger group that followed the strategy. Mike was the first one, Peter was later, you know, the list goes on and on. And particularly, the research department developed a strategy which I found remarkable. There would be an pre-FOMC memo on some topic, and then later it would turn into an economic quarterly. And then later it would turn into an academic publication. And there are just many, many examples of this if one looks at the Richmond Bank. An early one was when Marvin worked with Al Broadus on base drift, which came up last night. Marvin at the time was very much a monetarist, and he and Al were noting the phenomena of base drift and seeking to quantify how much it contributed to longer run evolution of the money stock. But then, within a year or two, Marvin was thinking about, why did base drift occur? How could this be the outcome of some optimizing pattern on the part of the monetary authority? And there's the first of his papers that I'm going to talk about is called Interest Rate Smoothing and Price Level Non-Stationarity, in which he brought together ideas of the smoothing of interest rates in a rational expectations model, which at that time was a delicate thing to do, and talked about how it could lead to non-stationarity, that is base drift in money and prices. So incredible link from question in FOMC meeting, paper in the EQ, academic publication, and with very direct links backward in terms of classic monetary economics. Marvin later wrote a great paper in Carnegie Rochester in '91 called Interest Rates and the Conduct of Monetary Policy. I strongly recommend you take a look back. It's remarkable what he was thinking about at the time. He became a favorite of Carl Brunner and Alan Meltzer, some of the founders of the SOMC. Carl and Alan loved nourishing younger Fed economists. They liked Marvin's passion and his perspective, and they published his work even when they disagreed. Now, one of the things that I found most interesting as I looked back at that paper was a modern explanation of the interaction between the funds rate and the term structure. Policy during '74 through '79 had involved fairly tight funds rate control with a highly persistent target. Building on or surveying work by Tim Cook, Marvin noted that the term structure seemed to shift in a parallel fashion out to a year as changes in the target took place. And it's a very shrewd insight. He had a positive theory of what the Fed was doing, and then he translated it into implications for the term structure. Something that, frankly, we learned as the first and most important application of rational expectations for policy modeling from Bill Poole. Marvin also had a strong view that even during the 1979 to 1982 period, the Fed was indirectly targeting interest rates. And this is something that he and I returned to later, and we argued about, and I don't know how it all wound up, but he had a strong view, based in part on work by Cook, that that was a phenomenon to be understood. Now, in this '91 Carnegie Rochester paper, he closes with a statement taken from testimony by Greenspan in 1989, when Greenspan was testifying simultaneously on the first version of the Neal Amendment for price stability and on proposed legislation to require disclosure on the part of the Fed. Once again, I recommend that the paper's discussion of this topic and the linkage back to similar statements by Benjamin Strong from the 1920s. Now, Greenspan argued that the Fed could use the lack of disclosure of the directive as part of a policy framework that would allow it to accomplish things that it could not otherwise. And shortly before this time, Marvin had spent time in Washington, as we learned last night, with Bill Poole at the Council of Economic Advisors, and he had gotten intensely interested in the question of information and the Fed. In Washington, information's everything, and you're just incredibly aware of that. And so the question for Marvin was, why shouldn't the Fed directive be released? And people are going to talk about this more extensively, so I'm going to basically skip over my slides on this topic. Bill Poole will discuss it in some detail. But I just want to point out that it is a remarkable paper on secrecy. First of all, sorting through a court case is no walk in the park if you've ever done it. Marvin obtained and then evaluated the Fed's argument in the favor of non-disclosure one by one. It was a pretty balanced scholarly presentation where he rejected some arguments, classified others as uncertain, and accepted some. He provided a historical perspective on the Fed's information policy, and he went off and he digested an abstract literature on information economics and the desirability of information. It's a remarkable presentation. And in ways that I think people will allude to later, it was a brave action. There were clear negative messages from Washington. even the Richmond working paper was held for a long time, with external publication being uncertain. But I think Marvin's paper helped pave the way toward increased transparency in monetary policy, even though that didn't occur until 1994. And he was, frankly, really worried about whether this was the end of his career in the Federal Reserve System, but he was comfortable, too, with the situation. I remember at one point, we were out for one of our long walks, and I described his work as too important to be released to the public. And he playfully punched me, got his Marvin grin. Now, the last paper I'm going to talk about is a paper that Marvin and I wrote on separating monetary and credit policy. If one looks at the Richmond EQ from the time, almost no article has an editor's note at the beginning. But this one has a long editor's note that basically says, it must be strongly emphasized that the views do not in any way represent. Now, the strongly part is an unusual addendum to the typical Fed line. So Marvin and I got working on this when he was visiting Rochester for the year, and we were asked to think about the consequences of financial deregulation for monetary policy. At the time, Marvin was teaching monetary and banking policy in the economics department. I was teaching financial intermediation and derivatives in the business school, and ideas of contracting based on work by Diamond, Gorton, and others were very much in the air. It was also a time when real business cycles was taking off. And Marvin and I, our first crack at thinking through the role of banking policy was to imagine Robinson Crusoe responding to a shift in the distribution of uncertain returns. And we had this in the AEI pre-conference draft. And Anna Schwartz, with a twinkle in her eye, said she thought our work was important, but she didn't think too much of this contribution to this Robinson Crusoe fellow. So it didn't make it. Marvin and I argued that monetary policy could, taken as simply management of the size of the balance sheet and control of currency and reserves, could accomplish most things that involved regular and crisis response. We reinterpreted Bagehot's rule, lend freely at a high rate, as simply a form of interest rate smoothing. Namely, if the funds rate spikes, you push it back down. And that can be accomplished without any supporting regulation. The line we drew between monetary policy, which involved the size of the balance sheet, and banking and credit policy, which involves switches in the composition of the Fed's assets, was one that we thought was useful. In the paper, we described the idea of a sterilized discount window transaction in which the Fed would make a loan and then it would undo it with open market operations. We didn't really realize it at the time, but this monetary policy versus banking and credit policy also corresponded neatly to some aspects of the institutional structure of the Fed, with the FOMC in charge of monetary policy and the board in charge of banking policy. Now, Marvin would not be happy with me if I just left things at this point. I mean, implicit in that paper is the argument that you should close the discount window, that moral hazard is important. And Marvin would say, well, okay, fine, that was 1988 or whatever. He was always forward-looking. He'd say, how does this apply to more recent events? Now, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the onset of the financial crisis in the summer of 2007. And going back and reading Federal Reserve transcripts and conference calls, what you can see is that there's a spike in the funds rate and an immediate set of temporary open market operations on the part of the Fed to offset those, comparable open market operations taking place in Europe. You can also see that the 3-month LIBOR moves up relative to the funds rate by a substantial amount. And so then the question is, what should one do, and what are the consequences of different kinds of policies? Now, if one looks at a plot of the behavior of various interest rates over the period, and I provide one in the handout, what you can see is that even though the Fed in its mid-August meetings chose to extensively introduce credit and banking policies, it really wasn't until they dropped the funds rate in September that the LIBOR rate dropped as well. And so Marvin would be happy with that. That was, to him, an example of the power of monetary policy. And indeed, if one looks over the subsequent year, it's really remarkable. The size of the Fed's balance sheet stays constant. It's like a flat line. And the composition shifts dramatically between various categories of securities as interventions take place in the financial sector. So kind of looks like there was a separation of banking and credit policy. Now, to my mind, it's very important that we try to understand this period, understand it better, understand what the lessons are for the future, and that we try to ask ourselves questions about what happened in the coming years. Now, for me, one of the major questions is, why didn't major financial institutions strengthen their balance sheets more between the summer of 2007 and the summer of 2008? And in my reading of this, we have to think about the potential role of banking and credit policy and prospective banking and credit policy as part of that outcome. I think you can look at that conference call on April 18th in 2007, and you can see that it appears that major financial institutions were being assured of banking and credit policy response. Now, that may well have been appropriate, but it may well have also had the side effect of forestalling private sector responses. Okay, so I've talked about some themes from Marvin's work: interest rate smoothing and monetary policy, information provision, and the separation of money and banking. Now, I feel like the ultimate tribute that all of us can make to Marvin is to continue thinking about the central issues in monetary policy with the same intensity, the same attention to historical and analytical depth of analysis, and the same combination of balanced analysis and provocative thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was a wonderful presentation. My name is Gregory Hess. I've been a member of the Shadow Market Committee probably for longer than I care to recognize. And Marvin was just, just a wonderful part of what we did here. He was a substantial and thoughtful person and economist. His communication style echoed his intrinsic nature, which was he was never wobbly. In his comments, he loved precision. He had a radar for weak and inconsistent thinking, and as people have mentioned, he was fairly direct about it. He embraced the toughest intellectual challenges with humility, and by his thoughts and actions, he lives the reason why the first course we take in economics is called Economic Principles rather than Economic Answers. Substantial, thoughtful, precise, humble, and principled are also core necessary ingredients in effective central bank communications. Our topic in this first panel is to engage in thoughtful dialogue about central bank communication and transparency, as well as Marvin's influence in these topics. I'll also add, a third leg to the stool here, which is accountability and central bank accountability. And we'll start off with just kind of the first paper that people talk so much about. To begin with, one of Marvin's very early controversial papers was his 1985 paper, where he basically articulated a view that he returns to many times in his career, that to understand the Federal Reserve in its fullest context, you had to understand that it resides in a political context, and more specifically in an open democratic society. In that, and you have to recall at the time, the book of the era was called The Secrets of the Temple, right? It was the book that described the Fed best of all, William Greider's, a popular book. I quote from his article, the discussion, as he concludes, and obviously this was a well-managed piece, but he does manage to get this in. The discussion highlighted a number of potential benefits and costs of central bank secrecy and identified some conditions under which secrecy could be socially desirable. At best, however, given the inconclusiveness of the theoretical arguments and the presumption that government secrecy is inconsistent with the healthy functioning of a democracy, further work is required to demonstrate that central bank secrecy is socially beneficial. The second principle that I think about in terms of Marvin's views on communications and transparency and accountability are that he felt that it actually would make monetary policy work better. Transparency and effective communication would make monetary policy work better. In 2008 St. Louis Fed commentary, he wrote, the primary role of transparency and communication must be to convey clearly the central bank's long-run inflation objective in order to anchor inflation expectations firmly, so that a central bank can manage short and longer-term real interest rates reliably with its nominal interest rate policy instrument. The third principle of Marvin's appreciation and one of the pieces to his effective communication and what he felt was effective communication monetary policy was his view and essentially inherited from his monetarist tradition the lexicographic primacy of the Fed's price stability mandate. And that's something that was intrinsic to all of who Marvin was. He believed this not only before during the period of great moderation and during the great inflation, his analysis of the great inflation scares, but he only strengthened, this only strengthened after as part of the post-financial crisis. In a 2012 SOMC article called The Fed Should Put Its 2% Inflation Goal to Work, he talks a lot about a September 13, 2012 statement that came out post-meeting. And at this point, I think Marvin was pretty agitated with the Fed. He wrote, why not adhere to its principles, reassure markets, and tie down inflation expectations firmly by reiterating its intentions to target 2% inflation on average over time? Failure to reiterate the 2% longer-run inflation goal only months after its announcement undermines its credibility and defeats its professed purpose of anchoring inflation expectations to improve the flexibility of monetary policy to act against unemployment. The market is left to wonder. He returns to this theme in what I believe is his final paper at the SOMC, which is in May 2017, which is The Fed Needs a Credible Commitment to Price Stability, where he pulls all these themes together. And in here is his recommendation, which might make some central bankers gasp, and maybe I'll pointedly ask them a little bit later. Maybe I won't. We'll see how it goes. He writes, finally, the FOMC should declare its intention in the statement of its longer-run goals and monetary policy strategy to invite the legislature to accept the inflation target to further enhance its credibility. And the FOMC should declare its intention to strengthen the legislative oversight process, to help enforce the systematic pursuit of monetary policy, that is, the period-by-period mitigation of fluctuations of inflation around its 2% target, while keeping employment close to its sustainable level. To do so, the Fed should include in its statement its intention to improve legislative oversight by presenting the FOMC's independently chosen monetary policy decisions against a familiar Taylor-type reference rule for monetary policy. Deeply principled and with opinions arrived at from a sense of humility stemming from the Fed's past struggles with inflation scares, Marvin's later sharp focus on the primacy of price stability and his emphasis on the importance of transparency in monetary policy objectives and decision-making required in an open democratic society define the arc of his substantial and outsized contribution to monetary policy communication. We owe him our great thanks. Just as we owe great thanks to today's panel speakers. We'll do them in alphabetical order. That seemed kind of rules-based. I thought that would be a good way to do it. And I asked around to see if anybody wanted to deviate. Everybody seemed okay with it. So the speakers, and they'll get no further introduction. I'll allow one question after each speaker, and then we'll have an open conversation afterwards. And I'll try to limit each speaker to about 12 minutes, just so we can stay on time. They will go in the following order. Professor Charles Calomiris of Columbia Business School, professor of Columbia Business School, Charles Evans, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, Donald Cohn, the Brookings Institution, former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and Loretta Mester, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today, and it's an honor to be here with my co-panelists, each of which I've known for a long time and have enormous respect for. And of course, that's a great tribute to Marvin that they're here. I'm going to just start and make some very brief comments about Marvin because they're very repetitive, which I think is itself very informative. When I think of Marvin, I think of three words: depth, integrity, and courage. Analytical depth, Bob King talked about at some great length. Integrity, intellectually and of advocacy, was just such a Marvin trait. And courage, I'll talk a little bit more, as Bob did and Greg did, about Marvin's early advocacy of transparency at the Fed when that wasn't an easy thing to do. And I think that I just want to pose, without commenting further, a counterfactual for all of you to think about just for a minute. Imagine if every economist in our country had the depth, integrity, and courage of Marvin Goodfriend. I think it's an interesting thing to think about. And certainly something that those of us who educate PhD students should be thinking a lot about. Now, the challenge for me, of course, I'm going to be following along in my slides, and I do have tables and graphs. So, of course, the challenge for me is to try to say something original about Fed communication, which is something that a lot has been said about, and a lot of good things have been said about that I'm going to comment on briefly, but I want to try to also push things in a little bit of a different direction. And I'm going to repeat some of the things initially that Greg pointed out, especially about Marvin's early work. So if you look at my first slide, it's called Perspectives on Fed Communication Clarity. It begins with what I want to call the pre-Marvin perspective, which is often attributed in some statements that the governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, said, "Never explain, never apologize." Sometimes people attribute that to Paul Volcker, but I think we can say that while Paul Volcker certainly agreed with that, I've heard him say it personally many times, he wasn't the first one to think of it. And Norman's quoted statement goes on to his first professional economist at the Bank of England, Henry Clay: "You're not here to tell us what to do, but to explain to us why we've already done it." And what that means, of course, is what economists are supposed to be as part of a propaganda apparatus whose job is to justify the central bank's actions and also to calm people, to say things that are soothing and helpful from the standpoint of the institution's desire to keep things calm. And I want to emphasize that part of the intellectual argument in favor of Fed secrecy, which was mentioned last night at dinner actually, was the concern, and legitimate concern. It's not just that the Fed it was a corrupt organization that wanted secrecy to protect itself against accountability, although of course all individuals do want to protect themselves against accountability. We shouldn't discount that. But that wasn't the only argument. The other argument was a concern about excessive market reactions to any transparent communication. And so when Marvin was making the case that Bob referred to earlier in favor of transparency, there were three things that were driving it, which you can see in the quotes that I have here on the first page, which actually Greg already alluded to. First of all, it was, this is a central bank that's embedded in a democracy, and in a democracy, the agents have responsibilities, and those have to be the first thing that you take into account. That's your existential for you as the central bank. The second thing is, Marvin came up during the rational expectations revolution, and we've already heard from Bob how he was influenced by Bill Poole's class. And something that all of us of that era found that we were sort of more in agreement with than our predecessors was that we had some faith that markets knew how to digest information. And so there was some faith that giving markets information wasn't necessarily going to create havoc. And third, the notion that transparency was actually fundamental to the Fed's own effectiveness. That is Marvin par excellence. And Greg's already explained it, but I want to really emphasize it. Let me give you an example. In recent years, Marvin was often what I think would be considered by outsiders to the committee dovish. In other words, Marvin was often advocating fairly aggressive monetary loosening in some sense across some different measures and different policy actions. But the thing about Marvin's advocacy was that it was dovishness with a purpose, which is contained in this statement here. Might not that lack of clarity about Fed inflation targeting destabilize inflation expectations and facilitate the uncertainty so detrimental for employment? And so what Marvin was concerned about was he wanted the Fed to be dovish, but he wanted the Fed to explain its dovishness differently from the way it was doing. He wanted the Fed to say, the reason we're dovish is because we have an inflation target, and we're currently below our inflation target, and so we want to be expansionary. Not constantly saying we're data dependent. We think it's, the employment number worries us. Oh no, next month it's going to be the labor participation rate that worries us. Oh, next month it's going to be something else that worries us. He wanted them to have a consistent, systematic framework and to explain their behavior with reference to that, with particularly a clear commitment to a long-term inflation target. And of course, he was sorely disappointed in that. And the last quote I put on the page as inspiration for me is Ben Bernanke's famous quote from 2015, monetary policy is 98% talk and only 2% action. And that kind of shares a little bit with Marvin's view that part of the reason for Fed transparency is that it empowers Fed action. But it's a very different kind of notion of how you empower the Fed action. And I think that it's fair to say that Bernanke was thinking of this more from the standpoint of when you're near or at the zero lower bound, forward guidance and words are, of course, your main tool. And he wanted to make effective use of that tool, but not necessarily within the framework of systematic policy. So what I want to, how much time do I have left, Greg?
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Okay, so I'm now going to try to say something new to you. Go to the next slide. And I want to emphasize that what we also need to do is positively study Fed communication, not just talk about what Fed communication should be from the standpoint of policy. And there's not been much of it, and I've been engaged in quite a bit of it recently. And I want to emphasize that when you think about Fed communication, there are three things that happen when the Fed communicates by publishing its minutes or its releases or its transcripts. The first thing is it informs us about the nature of the Fed's reaction function, its own policy framework, to the extent that it has one. Secondly, it informs us about the Fed's opinion of what the exogenous state of the economy is, which can be informative because we learn something about the exogenous state of the economy, I mean exogenous to Fed policy. And third, we may learn about Fed beliefs that are maybe even wrong from the perspective of the exogenous state of the economy. And the question is, which of these channels of communication are affecting the economy? What's the combination of these three things that Fed communication does? To make a long story short, I'm going to, on the next page, I have a bunch of questions that are sort of coming from that discussion, some simple positive economics questions. Do Fed communications create news that affects markets? How does that differ short-term versus long-term? Which things are affecting markets the most? Is there a natural interpretation of the news that tells us whether Fed communication is primarily working through one of these three channels that I mentioned in the prior page? So the first point I want to make is that what we learned by quantifying this, how do we do it? With the new techniques of natural language processing. I'll show you some results very briefly, but I know I'm going to run out of time. So the first thing we learn is that Marvin was right, that the market doesn't overreact to the Fed. In fact, the really interesting thing, I would say shocking thing, is that when we quantify Fed news in terms of language spoken by the Fed, what we find is that there's actually an increasing market reaction to the news from the Fed. So let me be specific. I'll show you the evidence in a minute, or maybe I won't. If you ask, does the Fed affect the dollar, the value of the dollar, with its news, measured through natural language processing of Fed statements? The answer is yes. If you ask, which is the larger effect, the Fed's effect on the date of the announcement or the week of the announcement, or its effect a year later on the exchange rate? And the answer is much, much larger effect a year later. Now the question is that because it takes the market a year to digest the news? That's nonsense. What really is happening is the Fed's information is telling us a lot about the state of the economy, and in particular, the risk state of the economy that's mattering for persistent exchange rate returns. I can tell you the same thing about the VIX. So in other words, a very big part, the dominant feature of Fed communications seems to be its usefulness as an indicator of the state of the economy, and particularly the risk state of the economy, not just about the Fed itself. As my wife would say to me about many of our conversations, you know what your big mistake is? I said, well, what is it? She says, you think it's all about you. So Fed communications, my point is, isn't only about the Fed's reaction function. It's also about, is the Fed doing the best job it can digesting and communicating information about the state of the economy, which turns out to be quite influential. And I just want to skip, because I know that I'm not going to have a lot of time, I want to skip to the graphs that you'll see, Fed prattle and the VIX, and point out to you, if you look at the top right and the lower left of those diagrams, you see a vector order regression with the short-term interest rate, the VIX, and a prattle, that's a company that creates its version of Fed speak, news produced by the Fed. I have my own independent version, but I thought I would use theirs. They give absolutely identical results. What you see from this is that when the Fed, back in the lower left corner, when the Fed surprises us, in this, that is from the standpoint of a vector order regression, when there's an innovation in Fed policy that's hawkish, the VIX goes down. Or alternatively, when the Fed is dovish, the VIX goes up. That's not because the Fed's creating risk, it's because the Fed's policies, announcements, and discussion of the economy is indicative of a change in the risk state, which is taken seriously. So the point is, the market does not overreact to it. In fact, over time, what we see from the standpoint of the exchange rate and the VIX is the Fed's communication actually has a lot of information content. Now on to the criticism, because I've run out of time. There are two papers I won't have a chance to talk about, but I do want to emphasize them because this is where it gets interesting. One is a paper by people at the board, Steve Sharp at the board in particular, showing that the Fed's own Green Book and Teal Book text actually does better than the Fed's Green Book and Teal Book forecasts. And one interpretation, I think the obvious one, is that the official forecasts of the Fed are holding back, acting kind of like a moving average of its own true views. So the first thing to note is there's evidence that the Fed is not fully updating its own beliefs in its forecasts, but rather smoothing them, possibly for some internal purposes. A second point is, in the regression analysis I didn't have a chance to talk to you about, the Fed's actions and other central banks' actions are hugely currently predictable on the basis of natural language processing of the newspaper. I mean 9 months to a year in advance. And what that's telling us is that the Fed is not making use of the current state-of-the-art data science tools for actually measuring the state of the economy and communicating it effectively. And to give you a sense of it, the R-squared is about a third to a half of change in monetary policy by the Fed and the other three largest central banks is forecastable a year in advance by natural language processing, which is quite remarkable. And that natural language processing has been shown to be working because it actually is a forecaster of the economy. So I would say my new point for the Fed is take the sand out of the wheels in terms of communicating your own true beliefs and get real with data science and start absorbing and communicating your corrected views of the real state of the economy, because the markets are depending on you. Sorry to go over time. Thanks very much.
All right, we're not going to take a question. We're going to go straight through the speakers, and then that'll give us a chance to have a more open conversation afterwards.
Oh, I see. So the rule is if I take longer, I don't have to take a question.
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you.
Nobody has
I'm really
to.
honored to be invited to attend and present at this conference. I want to thank the organizers for arranging this remarkable conference to honor Marvin Goodfriend's contributions to monetary economics and policy. As a graduate student in the early 1980s at Carnegie Mellon, I observed Marvin's enthusiasm for economics and policy whenever he attended the Carnegie Rochester Conference in Pittsburgh. I don't know why the following is notable, but it came to my mind. Marvin wore these sand-colored suede Oxfords that just, you could see, and he could make that work in a way that I never could. I first met him as an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina when he collaborated with my colleague and his classmate, Professor John McDermott, on projects related to endogenous growth. Highly cited work. Marvin had wide-ranging interests. Marvin always had great insights, and I probably best absorbed some important monetary economics material from Marvin's clear exposition of the transmission of the federal funds rate to changes in the yield curve, the implications of non-borrowed reserves targeting during the Volcker monetary tightening of 1979 to 82, and the initial hair-on-fire concepts of what Marvin referred to as inflation scares. Marvin was always an outstanding monetary economist, researcher, and teacher. Inflation scares is such a great phrase. It always seemed to me that Marvin enjoyed refocusing the terms of the debate by changing the language that I preferred to use. Maybe it's just me. Anyway, by the way, these are my own comments and not those of anyone else in the Federal Reserve System or on the FOMC.
That's right.
Greg Hess circulated some excellent Goodfriend papers to our panel. They reminded me of how long Marvin had worked on issues of central bank communications and transparency and how far ahead of the times he was on this topic. He was an early proponent of an idea we now take as gospel, that a central bank should have a well-determined policy goals, and that it should communicate how it is using policy to achieve these outcomes. We certainly have come a long way since Marvin started writing about this in the early 1980s. From saying nothing to now doing things like publishing individual FOMC participants' assumptions about appropriate monetary policy. While surfing around to gauge what Marvin had said about guidance on interest rates, I found the following two quotations. The first is from a 2006 commentary on a paper by Glenn Rudabush and John Williams discussing central banks publishing policy rate forecasts. Quote, if a central bank chooses to publish its interest rate projection, it should present that projection as part of a comprehensive economic forecast that recognizes the interconnectedness of the economy and interest rate policy. In particular, interest rates should be understood to be a forward-looking stabilizing force in the macroeconomy, reacting to and offsetting prospective macroeconomic forces that would otherwise destabilize inflation, employment, and output. Central bank forecasts should give a coherent, consistent reflection of a central bank's overall view of current and prospective macroeconomic conditions. Coherent is such a great word here. The second is from the 2008 paper Greg circulated. Quote, forward guidance on interest rate policy is likely to be most effective when it reinforces a well-articulated monetary policy strategy anchored by an explicit numerical long-run inflation target. Otherwise, forward guidance should be undertaken with care and only with good reason, given that discretionary announcements are difficult, if not impossible, to calibrate consistently to achieve their intended effect, unquote. I feel confident that the FOMC's adoption beginning in December 2012 through March of 2014 fit Marvin's criteria in support of the Fed's dual mandate objectives, anchored with an explicit 2% symmetric inflation objective. The FOMC indicated that the federal funds rate would remain unchanged as long as unemployment remained above 6.5%, provided that inflation was no higher than 2.5%. I bring these up now because of how they relate to a topic on the FOMC's plate today. That is our review of monetary policy strategies, tools, and communication practices. Federal Reserve officials and economists have talked about many different operational frameworks for addressing the effective lower bound on interest rates. On this subject, of course, Marvin was an early contributor. See his work on Japan in the 1990s. These policies share the feature that business as usual monetary policy needs to be adjusted so that private sector expectations become aligned with the Fed's policy goals. In particular, I think a takeaway from our Fed Listens conference in the literature is that the Fed will likely need to do something out of our historical norm in order to remove the inherent downward bias on inflation expectations caused by the proximity of the effective lower bound on interest rates. Marvin's research on negative nominal policy rates is crucially relevant. By merely introducing the likelihood that negative rates can be deployed by the central bank, it's easy to imagine a reflationary impact. Now, I don't really favor negative interest rates myself. In so much of my commentary, I take the view that loud advocacy for do what it takes policy is very important. In theory, if negative interest rates are used enthusiastically, the downward bias on inflation that is caused by an effective lower bound constraint should go away. More generally, a credible commitment to do something different is necessary so that private sector long-run inflation expectations will be centered at 2% inflation. When it was mentioned that Marvin enthusiastically said in 2012 in the fall, if you're going to do this, why don't you say you're going to get inflation up to 2%? I concur with that. Furthermore, this something different will likely include the use of unconventional policy tools, including asset purchases and forward guidance on policy rates, as well as a period of inflation purposely running above 2%, purposefully. As all of these elements likely will be necessary to ensure the appropriate alignment of inflation expectations. One thing I've learned from all of our discussions is that the communications challenges associated with any of these alternative operational frameworks may be large. The mechanics of the various alternatives might seem obvious to us as we grind through the standard forward-looking, I call it the new Keynesian model we all find so familiar. But, I know this might sound shocking, not everyone looks at the world through this lens. For example, in a strict backward-looking average inflation targeting regime, it might be difficult for the public to make the distinction between the intermediate inflation rates we would aim at and our overarching symmetric 2% inflation target. Similarly, the use of inflation ranges instead of a point target could be challenging because a range will be considered by some as a zone of inaction. Such a misunderstanding has negative consequences. As recent work by my colleague Leonardo Malozzi and his co-authors Francesco Bianchi and Matthias Rotny show, a symmetric range of inaction about 2% will not solve the effective lower bound inflation downward bias problem. To solve the bias in a range regime, you either need an asymmetric range about your target, say 1 3/4 to 2.5, or commit to much more aggressive responses when inflation falls below the range than when inflation rises above. However, both of these seem pretty tough to communicate as well. So how do we overcome these challenges? I think the answer is related to those two quotations from Marvin. Here I take a page out of Marvin's standard playbook, it seems to me, create a new language. I usually call it outcome-based policy. Now, by the way, am I the only person, I know I don't remember long walks, but I do remember getting coffee after clearing security and having a long wait before a flight. Am I the only person who would repeatedly have discussions with Marvin with progressively louder exchanges of what to me seemed opposing views And then suddenly Marvin would break in on me and say, hey, I'm trying to express your point in a more effective way. Like Charlie Calamera said, dovishness with a purpose, always with a purpose. Anyway, as I said, using Marvin's playbook to create a fancier term for your favorite idea, I see outcome-based policy this way. As always, the Fed needs to emphasize that our mission is to set interest rates and, when needed, other policy tools, with the express goal of achieving our dual mandate objectives of maximum employment and price stability. We should make it clear that any particular operating procedure we use is simply a tool to achieve these final goals, and not in itself a summary statistic for gauging policy success. In other words, we describe how our actions are going to achieve our final goals. Here I want to put in a plug for the summary of economic projections, particularly the much maligned dot plot. These forecasts are an extremely useful, coherent communications tool as long as each participant publishes an SEP projection of a policy path and economic outcomes that, kludging together some words from these quotes of Marvin's, provides a coherent, consistent view of current and prospective macroeconomic conditions and a well-articulated monetary policy strategy anchored by our explicit policy goals. And when circumstances call for a change in the policy path, the change in the SEP dots and economic forecast would reinforce, again, paraphrasing Marvin's words, that, quote, interest rates are a forward-looking stabilizing force in the macroeconomy, reacting to and offsetting prospective macroeconomic forces that would otherwise destabilize inflation, employment, and output, unquote. Such outcome-based focus of policy can be easily understood. It does require that we present a coherent linkage between our policy tools and our policy goals. Though it won't always be easy, I think we can be up to that challenge. We certainly have a lot more communications tool to do so than when Marvin first started writing about the secrets of the temple. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. I would say, is it fair to comment on Charlie? So it would be a coherent, the dot plot would be coherent if we knew which dot went with which GDP forecast and which inflation forecast, but we don't know that. All right, got that off my chest. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Marvin and I interacted often as we both served in the Federal Reserve System together for about close to 30 years, comparing notes on developments in macroeconomics and monetary policy at numerous conferences and informal contacts around the edges of FOMC meetings and elsewhere. We didn't always agree, of course. In fact, conference organizers like to position Marvin and me as the pro and con on explicit inflation targeting. These were great learning opportunities for me. Marvin marshaled empirical evidence and embedded that evidence in the theory and practice of central banking history. Marvin was open and honest about his views and the supporting evidence. And however much I might have differed with his conclusions, I could never doubt his focus on and devotion to bringing his considerable intelligence and deep learning to serving the interests of the Federal Reserve and the United States. And I always enjoyed those interchanges. In the end, Marvin's analysis prevailed. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, I was won over to the view that the benefits of an explicit inflation target would exceed its costs, and the Fed, of course, adopted a 2% target in 2012. Now, the rationale for those shifts were only indirectly related to Marvin's arguments in the debates we were having that the target and associated commitment were required as a bulwark against high inflation and the inflation scares we've talked about previously. Rather, my conversion and the explicit inflation target emerged from the threat that the Federal Reserve would miss both its employment and inflation targets on the low side. I saw an explicit inflation target as helping gain support for additional monetary policy action from members of the committee of the FOMC who, like Marvin, feared that unconventional policies might cause much higher inflation down the road. And the target was adopted when the major risk was that inflation expectations would fall, and that would limit the range scope for policy easing in the future. But I think the essence of Marvin's vision has been retained. The Federal Reserve has made an explicit public commitment to achieving 2% inflation over time, reinforcing the implicit target that I was arguing for. And it has framed its ongoing discussion of policy, strategy, tools, and communications, Charlie was discussing, around that commitment. Now, that discussion of policy in a low-rate environment has already seen advances in Fed openness that would please Marvin. It has announced the process was underway, held these Fed Listen sessions to get input from the public and from academics. It has reported on the progress of its deliberations in the minutes of the FOMC, and several members of the FOMC have kept us informed about the evolution of their own thinking in their speeches. Since this is a panel on transparency, I'll take a few minutes to reflect on the communication piece of the Fed's discussion, putting forward a wish list of what I hope comes out of the process. First, clarity about the strategy. By clarity of strategy, I do not mean necessarily adopting a hard rule for making up misses from 2%, say with a price level target, or averaging over a particular period of time, or following an interest rate rule of some sort to get there. I haven't been converted on that, that's for sure. Those are decisions on strategy, not communication. I want to talk about communication. But I do think communication should give us clarity about whatever approach is adopted. Where are the hard lines? Where's the fuzziness? Why this approach is expected to achieve the appropriate outcomes? The effectiveness of any strategy, especially at or near the effective lower bound on interest rates, is enhanced when financial market participants and other economic agents can understand the strategy and can anticipate the deployment of tools, the path of interest rates, and the use of unconventional policies. We don't have that clarity now. For example, the FOMC describes its inflation target as symmetrical, but never defines symmetry, and I have the clear sense that it means different things to different policymakers. Charlie Evans and I spent a lunch discussing different interpretations of symmetry and how his interpretation wasn't necessarily the same as his colleagues. In addition, transparent explanations of policy would relate meeting-to-meeting decisions to the longer-term strategy. And over recent years, the strategy statement has been reissued every January, then most of the time not referenced as decisions are made and explained. I recognize that consensus on a large and diverse committee sometimes entails a bit of fudging on the exact meaning of words used. Some would have accused me of being an expert in devising those words. But fudging has costs as well as benefits, and I hope the current round of discussion produces a statement of strategy that is clearly defined and agreed by all the participants and utilized by them as they explain their decisions to the public. That would be effective communication. Second, clarity about tools. The use of unconventional tools of enhanced forward guidance, asset purchases was new during the crisis and slow recovery. And from that, the experience of the Fed and other central banks, we've all learned quite a bit about their effects and how they can best be deployed to maximize their effectiveness. The exact utilization of the tools to implement strategy when policy is near the effective lower bound will depend on circumstances, of course. But to the extent economic agents can accurately forecast their use, policy will be more effective with shorter lags and less uncertainty. The FOMC should tell us what lessons they have drawn from their experience and research and how they are most likely to shape forward guidance and asset purchases when they need to. What order are they likely to be deployed? Have they ruled out certain unconventional policies like negative interest rates or discount window incentives to lend? And if so, why? Third, clarity about risks and uncertainty. This subject is probably a bit oxymoronic on the surface. How can you have clarity about the risks around the central forecast, and especially about uncertainty in the Knightian sense, where you can't even assign probabilities? Still, I'd mark the Federal Reserve as needs improvement in communicating on both these fronts. For example, FOMC projections released after each quarterly meeting include ranges of the projections and median, but no sense of the wide range of possibilities that surround that median. The median itself can be easily moved by one or two changes in forecasts, so it doesn't really give a robust sense of the central tendency of the committee, and it gives a false sense of certainty about the FOMC's expectations about the course of those variables, especially the federal funds rate. Still, it seems to be a focus, certainly of the markets, and even on occasion the Fed itself, as explains its policy stance. When those forecasts are released with the minutes, they are accompanied by a measure of forecast error of private forecasters. I recognize that finding the appropriate measure of risk and uncertainty is hard when the FOMC itself doesn't have a forecast, but some way needs to be found to put that median in perspective and, frankly, take some attention away from it. I also find that under some circumstances, speeches about monetary policy fail to acknowledge risk and uncertainty, including our lack of understanding about economic relationships and hence about the likely course of policy. So I would urge speakers to be humble about what they know and convey the range of uncertainty that they're dealing with. True transparency acknowledges our limited understanding of underlying economic relationships and of the forces bearing on the outlook. Policymakers have an obligation to discuss their understanding and expectations about these relationships and forces, but they must be humble about what they know and transparent about the high likelihood of alternative outcomes. The rollout of the decisions on strategy tools and communication. The rollout of whatever comes out of the Fed's deliberations on the challenges of policy in a low-rate world would be an opportunity to underline the Federal Reserve's commitment to a high level of transparency. Here are my recommendations. It's a lot easier when you're not in the system. So recommendation number one, a white paper fully explaining the decisions, why they were taken, how they were based on experience and research, what was rejected and why, how they are expected to play out, and an appendix to that paper containing all the staff memos that went to the FOMC. Those memos that will be public in 4 or 5 years anyhow. So we can have better insight into what one of the key inputs into the decisions were made. Consistent with my previous, well, I skipped a recommendation, but one of my recommendations would be continue to reach out to wider audiences. Consistent with that recommendation, the white paper should be fronted by a short, easily comprehended explanation of the conclusions of the study and their relationship to the Fed's dual mandate. Second, a press conference, separate from the regular monetary policy press conference shortly after the paper is published. Third, an opportunity for congressional scrutiny of the decisions. And this is consistent with, as I think Charlie pointed out, Marvin's concern that the 2% target didn't have sufficient congressional buy-in. So certainly that Marvin made that case for a hearing very strongly. And fourth, a conference to bookend the Fed Listens conferences to get reactions from a variety of audiences, including some of the academics who gave papers at the conference last June. I think with such a rollout, the Fed would have strengthened, underlined its the urgency to increase its openness and honored the memory of Marvin, who pushed for more transparency at all times. Thank you.
So a tradition at FOMC meetings is that the research directors go out for dinner the night before the meetings. And sometimes some of the Reserve Bank presidents join that group. So shortly after I had been appointed research director at the Philadelphia Fed in 2000, a group of us, which included my president and Marvin Goodfriend, were walking to dinner when an accident happened. In the midst of a robust conversation, the Philly Fed president walked into a metal parking sign and cut his forehead. Okay, so the prospect of losing the bank's president to a bout of tetanus flashed through my mind. It was clear to me that he had to go to the emergency room to get patched up. I will say it did take some convincing, but he and I headed over to George Washington University Hospital, where he was quickly taken to the back for triage. So that was the last I saw of him for a very long time. And if any of you have ever experienced the waiting area of a large urban emergency room, you understand that it's not the most comfortable place to be. So after a couple of hours waiting, you can imagine my surprise when I saw Marvin Goodfriend walking through the emergency room door. Dinner was over, and he had come back to check on me, knowing it was going to be a long night. I have never forgotten this act of kindness and caring for an individual. And I'm telling you this story now because it really illustrates to me the kind of person Marvin was. He was a great scholar. We're going to talk about that all day today. He advanced knowledge in the field of monetary policy, but not just out of intellectual curiosity, but because he really cared about people. He understood that if policymakers did things right, they could improve how the economy works for real people. And I feel very fortunate to be part of this conference that honors Marvin Goodfriend and recognizes his many contributions to the theory and practice of monetary policy. So our session is discussing the contributions Marvin made to our understanding of the role of transparency and communication in monetary policymakers. So I thought I'd frame my remarks around two of the things that Marvin indicated in his confirmation hearing statement that he would pursue if confirmed. First, Marvin planned to draw on his, quote, academic and professional experience to promote policies that would further increase transparency and accountability at the Federal Reserve. Of course, this is a worthy pursuit. Congress has given the Fed a mandate to promote price stability and maximum employment, and it has given the Fed independence in making monetary policy decisions in pursuit of these goals. This independence shouldn't be taken for granted. It's been shown to yield better economic outcomes. But a central bank cannot expect to remain independent from the political process unless it is held accountable for its policy decisions and it's transparent about the basis for those decisions. So Marvin was a strong advocate of transparency in monetary policy making and clear communications about the strategy policymakers use to set policy. But importantly, he was also a persuasive advocate. Many of Marvin's suggestions that were contrary to how policy setting was being done at the time have become standard operating practice in central banking. Recall that it wasn't until 1994 that the FOMC began to explicitly announce changes in its Fed funds rate target. At a time when the Federal Reserve was quite secretive, Marvin argued that more transparency would confer social benefits by helping to align markets and policymakers' expectations. Another example is that well before the Fed adopted its explicit numerical inflation target in 2012, Marvin had been explaining the benefits such an explicit goal would play in anchoring inflation expectations. And he argued further that the Fed's actions and its communications needed to be designed so as to make this goal a credible commitment on the part of the Fed. One way to do this is to ensure that policymakers are taking a systematic approach to setting policy, which can help align the public's policy expectations with policy decisions, thereby helping to transmit monetary policy to the broader economy. So policy rules are one way to foster systematic policymaking, and Marvin suggested that the FOMC refer to a Taylor-type rule when explaining its policy decisions. Of course, as all you know, the FOMC has been reluctant to relinquish policymaking to following a simple rule because no one rule works well enough across a variety of economic models and circumstances, and judgment will likely always be needed as a part of policymaking. Nonetheless, rules do provide useful benchmarks, and the Board of Governors has begun recently to include a discussion of rules as benchmarks in the Monetary Policy Report. In some of my speeches, I have referred to simple rules that have been shown to yield good economic outcomes as reference points to explain my own views of appropriate policy. And the Cleveland Fed's website regularly updates the outcomes of 7 simple policy rules across several forecasts. Of course, one of the communications challenges for the FOMC continues to be how to convey to the public a good sense of how policy is likely to respond conditional on how the economy evolves. without implying that policy is pre-committed to a particular policy path regardless of how the economy evolves. My own view is that if the committee were willing to expand what it says in its post-meeting statement, it could give a better sense of its reaction function, its medium-run outlook, and the risks around the outlook, as well as its policy rationale. I think the statement could provide a summary of changes in a consistent set of indicators on inflation, inflation expectations, the unemployment rate, employment growth, output growth, and financial conditions that the committee regularly assesses to formulate its outlook in view of appropriate policy. The statement would convey whether the accumulated changes in these indicators have materially changed the committee's outlook. That outlook and the risks around the outlook would also be summarized, and the statement would then describe the committee's policy decision, tying the policy to the achievement of its policy goals, given the outlook and risks just described in the statement. The statement would articulate the considerations the committee would take into account when determining future changes in policy to help the public anticipate how policy is likely to change in response to changes in economic developments that affect the economic outlook without having to be prescient about how those conditions will actually evolve. Now, since the FOMC's assessment of risk is an important part of the policy decision, for the 4 meetings a year in which the FOMC releases its Summary of Economic Projections, or SEP, the committee could release the balance of risk graphs that are part of the SEP with the other graphs released at the time of the press conference, rather than waiting 3 weeks to release them with the minutes of the meeting. So I believe enhancements like this would allow the FOMC to better control the narrative about its economic and policy views. And I think they're consistent with Marvin's desire to increase the FOMC transparency in a productive way. A second thing Marvin said in his confirmation hearing statement was that his years at the Richmond Fed, quote, gave him a deep appreciation of the role of the regional reserve banks in the Federal Reserve System, end quote, and that the regional structure encourages diverse perspectives and innovative thinking that he would consider in formulating monetary policy if confirmed. In 1998, Marvin was a presenter at a workshop on the structure of the newly formed European Central Bank and laid out some of the benefits of a decentralized structure of the Federal Reserve System. The regional structure enhances credibility by making the institution less prone to political pressure. The diffusion of power across the 12 regional reserve banks helps build rapport with constituencies throughout the country. The regional structure also aids communication. It helps the institution collect information on economic and financial developments across the country. The reserve banks have boards of directors drawn from the private sector and typically have multiple advisory councils. Their presidents and staff speak regularly with a large number of contacts representing business, labor, consumers, and banking. And in a dynamic economy, anecdotal information from the regional reserve banks can provide early indications of changing sentiment or developing trends well before they show up in the data. Because the dispersion of activity across the country is not even, the regional structure also allows for some specialization and expertise about particular industries relevant to each region, expertise that can be called on when needed. A further benefit of the regional presence is that it helps the Fed disseminate its policy messages via speeches and presentations made by Reserve Bank officials. In addition, it provides a way to collect information about the impact of its policy in the community. You heard already about the Fed Listens events that the system held as part of its ongoing review of its monetary policy framework. I think that shows as an example of the power of the regional structure in the system. So these events, of Fed Listen events, were held across the country to gain perspectives of people with diverse backgrounds and in different economic circumstances about how the dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices affect them. As has been documented, and Mike Bordeaux and Ned Prescott have a recent paper on this, the regional reserve banks have also been able to provide thought leadership within the Federal Reserve System. Reserve Bank economists regularly interact with academic economists and have provided a way for diverse analytical methods and innovative thinking to enter into the process of monetary policy making, helping the institution guard against groupthink and leading to better policy outcomes. Ideas such as rational expectations, time consistency, the important role of credibility and commitment, and inflation targeting first came into the system via a reserve bank. Now, the Federal Reserve has been criticized at times for offering a cacophony of views that can be detrimental to clear communication. However, the reality is that the economy is complex, and so is monetary policy making. Different models, techniques, and measurements need to be brought to bear in order to assess appropriate monetary policy. Participants on the FOMC bring their perspectives to the table, and these perspectives are inputs into the consensus building process. While the FOMC works hard to get to a consensus, there will inevitably be times when individual policymakers hold different views. These diverse views are shared with the public and ultimately result in better policymaking as sound ideas get traction. Indeed, the contributions that Marvin Goodfriend made while he was an economist and policy advisor at the Richmond Fed prove this point. His arguments on the value of transparency and good communication in monetary policymaking began in the 1980s and ultimately gained traction within the system. I think the FOMC can thank Marvin Goodfriend for starting us on our journey toward better policy communications in support of more effective monetary policy. It's a journey that continues to this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for these incredible insights and contributions. We have a little under 20 minutes for Q&A. I know somebody has an 11 o'clock phone call. That might give them enough time to scamper and find a quiet spot. So we'll open the floor. I can see a little better if I'm standing up here. Does anybody have a question? Andy's, and then we'll start with Andy, and then we'll move it around, please. Please wait for the mic.
Well, I just want to start by saying thanks to Charlie and Don and Loretta. Really remarkable tribute to Marvin, especially Loretta's words. I'll remember that story now for a long time. So one question for each of you. I'll start with Loretta. The last statement at the end of January, the FOMC changed 3 words out of about 300. One of those words was the name of a month, and the other 2 were adjectives. I show this to my class. We looked at previous ones from last year, and then we met that day, so we were trying to guess, like, well, how many words in the statement will change today? And most of them thought at least 10, 20. And we're kind of stunned that there were really only 2 substantive words that changed. I appreciate what you're describing about trying to add more information. I'm just wondering how you think about, like, there's a deeper problem here. It's not just expanding from 300 to 500 or 1,000. It's making the whole process more flexible and informative. So the question for Don is, I think this Fed Listens thing can't be a one-off. It should become a regular exercise, maybe every 3 years, maybe every 4, every 5. That could be discussed. Actually, should be part of the conclusions of this. How often should the Federal Reserve be doing this going forward? And a question I think would be, should this be more explicitly under the oversight of Congress? And one way to do that would be to actually, for the Federal Reserve to encourage Congress to institutionalize this as part of the Federal Reserve Act, that every 4 years or every 5 years, the Fed will do this. And that legislation could include many of the things you suggested in terms of transparency of both the process and the outcomes. I'm just wondering if you think that would be worth pursuing. Now, for Charlie, the elephant in the room here, I just checked a few minutes ago, there's now a 50-50 chance in the CME FedWatch tool that the Fed will be at the zero bound within another couple months. 50-50 chance. The 2 years is at 40, the 5 years at 50, the 10 years at 70 basis points. The extent here which the Fed has a strong commitment to maximum employment and price stability, and may not be able to use the tools that it used 10 years ago in very different circumstances. Can you help us get our minds around? This is an elephant in the room. We got to acknowledge it's here and think about it.
Loretta?
Okay. So, Andy, did we get the month right?
It was a forecast.
I hope we did.
We won't say who did it, but
Yeah. So, I don't know. I've talked about this several times. Maybe I'm naive, but I think part of the problem, I call it the hotel California problem, right? Because we're so terse in the statements, and we don't really give a full explanation of our rationale and our outlook for the economy and the risks around it. Each word in that statement has a lot of weight on it, a lot of weight. So making changes to words in the regime that we're in now, right, there's a reluctance to do that because of the signal that that word change will give. Maybe I'm naive, but I just think that if we were a little bit broader in sort of what we describe in our statement, start out with our view of, what changed in the economy, right? Consistently talk about the same indicators each time, what those cumulative changes mean for our outlook, what that outlook is, and the risks around the outlook. We'd end up with a longer statement, but I think we probably would have less weight on each particular word because it would be a narrative, and we would have our narrative out there rather than having the public have to fill in the narrative. And sometimes the narrative they fill in are not necessarily what we wanted to convey in the statement. So, I agree that it's a heroic, we're not there yet. I look to maybe Don can talk about this, some of the communications from the Bank of England, and I kind of appreciate them. I think they're a little broader in terms of explaining how they think, and recognizing that, yes, there are different audiences for our communications probably is worthwhile as well. But yeah, as I said, we're still on the journey.
Yeah, Charlie Calmeres has a quick comment here, please.
I also want to say that if you look at the minutes and you look at the releases, what you find is the bigger within-day effects on the markets are from the releases, as you'd expect. If you look at a longer time horizon, the minutes have bigger effects than the releases.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot more information in the minutes.
Okay. Please, Don.
So a little bit reacting to what Loretta said, and certainly my experience, Loretta, is exactly as you described. When I was writing those releases for Alan Greenspan to edit, and I would try to re-explain every time, and he would say, the market will, this is Charlie's point, the market will react. Mm-hmm. We don't know how it's going to react. Let's make as few changes as possible because we could be sending messages we don't understand. On the Bank of England, the bank is in a regime now where both the Monetary Policy Committee and the Financial Policy Committee, on which I sit, release the minutes with the announcement. Now, you're able to do that in part because great swaths of the minutes are written ahead of time based on, well, the stuff that's just describes what's happened, but also there's been some preliminary discussions and meetings ahead of time, so the staff has a view before we even get to the policy meeting, but also we end up sitting around a table, line by line, word by word, editing those things. Now, there are 12 of us, 19 potentially of you guys doing that. And everybody's in the same place. So it's a little bit easier for them, but I agree. I think more, what you described, I thought, sounded a bit like the chairman's opening statement in the press conference. Yeah. So if you could do that more frequently and get the FOMC to buy into it, that's the issue. On the Fed listens, I don't think I'd be in favor of Congress stepping in here. I don't think it should have to. I think the Fed should have a regular program. The Reserve Banks already do this to a considerable extent, and they could do more, reaching out to folks on a regular basis, on a regular thing. So I wouldn't see this as an every 4 or 5 years. I would see this as amping up, using the experience of Fed Listens to amp up just the regular contacts and the group you contact with, you come in contact with. One thing that the part I skipped because Greg gave me the signal about time was reaching out to more audiences. And one thing the Bank of England does that I think the Fed could do is, so when we release a financial stability report, it comes in 3 layers. The top layer is our 3 big points we want to get across to the public. And they're in one sentence, and they're an illustration suitable for tweeting. Okay. The second layer digs down a little more deeply under those 3 or 4 points and gives some graphs and some explanation that really is for the journalists writing things up that afternoon. And then the third layer is the report itself for the nerds, the cognoscenti who want to dig into all the reasoning. And I think the Fed should pay attention to this layering thing.
Charlie, I know you got the tough one. I don't know if any of your colleagues are sitting in the audience, probably glad that it's you, not them, but please, you got the elephant in the room.
Well, thanks, Greg. Andy, I think you got to go back and, inform your students that when you've got an opportunity to ask a voting member of the FOMC, you should ask them the question.
Quite the gentleman,
But having said that, all right, it turns out that President Messer and I rotate our vote, and so this is yours this time.
We'll never be against one another. That's the key thing.
It's a great line. Loretta has promised me she will never vote
I will never
against
vote
me.
against it.
Yes, that's correct. If you go back to our January meeting, and, I think that what the FOMC had done was position the economy in a forward-looking fashion with 3 rate cuts in 2019 so that we were well-positioned to take on a couple of risks. We didn't have a name for the risk. Now, today, there's a name on the risk. It's not something that was necessarily on my radar, although we knew that it was taking place in China. I thought Don's comments were extremely interesting on uncertainty. They're certainly true. When I say I didn't know the name of the risk, I don't know how I would have talked about this in January. Humans want certainty. We're rarely happy with uncertainty. It is the case that within our briefing documents, the Board of Governors presents us with some alternative simulations. It's got, names to a certain type of shock and a policy response that, follows a rule because you have to have something to do that. And so you could, do scenario analysis and play that out. But let me remind you what that would look like. You would kind of go, okay, we just took an action. We think the economy's in a good place. Think the funds rate path might be relatively flat. But of course, it could be different. One reason it could be different is there could be a demand recession. And if there was a case like that, I would expect the funds rate to go down. Another one is Phillips curve. Now you get into nerdly stuff pretty quickly. Steepens, and inflation could be picking up because we've got low unemployment, and you'd give some commentary to these really large bands around the funds rate. But I don't know that people would be that happy with it. So describing uncertainty is very difficult. But at the moment, we're facing a new risk. Public health safety is paramount. That's really the first, second, and third response, and getting on top of the emerging spread of COVID-19 has to be the highest priority among everything that's taking place today. But of course, the Fed is going to be paying attention to how this is progressing and responding as appropriate like that. So.
All right, thanks. We got a whole range of questions. I'll go with Mickey, and we're going to try to keep them shorter. So I'll go Bob, and then David, and then over here. Please, Mickey. We have about 8 minutes, 9 minutes, everyone.
Maybe we should collect a bunch.
All right.
You could go a little longer.
Okay, all right.
Charlie, you mentioned dot plots and you're in favor of them. No.
Oh, God, so ambiguity.
President Evans, you mentioned the dot plots, you want to keep them, but you also mentioned uncertainty. And Don, you emphasized uncertainty. And so don't we need to put in measures of uncertainties into the dot plots and not just associate the GDP and unemployment with each dot? But let's consider the current situation. The Fed, you lowered rates 50 basis points this week, and the next dot plot and SEPs are going to be later this month, and presumably, the median GDP is going to be lower and all that, but wouldn't now be the time to use this as an example to say, how about putting in a range of forecasts? Ask all the FOMC members, what's your baseline? What's your kind of downside risk? What's your upside risk? And then ask each FOMC member to associate a Fed funds rate appropriate with a downside as well as an upside. And that would provide a lot of information to the public, particularly in this environment where uncertainty is dominant.
Okay, well, I think there was a motion to take a few more questions all at once. We'll do that. David, please. David Servos. I'll try to pick people closer together next time. I'm sorry.
So I'm going to take a cue from Charlie and just ask the question directly to Loretta, since we get a maybe we'll get a more interesting response. Charlie did a great job at deflecting that one, I thought. So suppose in the next few weeks to a month, 2 months, the S&P's down at 2,500, the high-yield bond market's shut, small businesses are not accessing loans, and the virus is moving through the United States. We're closing schools, we're closing airports, we're closing. What's a large-scale natural disaster of sorts, I would call it, or disaster. Once we assume we get to zero, which is the first set of steps, which would be maybe 2 more 50 basis point cuts, how would you articulate, and how we think about articulating what the next steps are? In particular, the QE that comes after that or with that, and any sort of lending programs or 13.3 type programs directed toward the affected parties like small businesses. Obviously, this is very different than giving money to banks that are over-levered, as we had in 2008, or money center banks. It's not a banking crisis. It's going to be much more of a small business and an individual issue. So how would you think about articulating that via transparency to us in the market so we can better understand the reaction function? Thanks.
All right, Bob King, and then I think Bill Poole, and then we'll have to probably, and then.
So themes in Marvin's research included the importance of credibility and the positive implications of lack of credibility, and communication, as we've been talking about. And I'd like to ask the panel to consider how the two of those interact. So in particular, if you're an imperfectly credible central bank, how does that influence the kinds of communications that you want to make? And so just to make this particular topic real versus the last crisis and potentially the current crisis, I want to read from a speech by Don Cohn, which I think actually puts things really squarely.
When was it?
2009, October. And what Don says is, since the interest rate was lowered to about zero, the committee has provided some guidance about the future path of the federal funds rate. To be sure, we have not followed the theoretical prescription of promising to keep rates low enough for long enough to create a period of above normal inflation. The arguments in favor of such a policy hinge on a clear understanding on the part of the public that the central bank will tolerate increased inflation only temporarily, say for a few years, once the economy has recovered, before returning to the original inflation target. In standard theoretical model environments, long-run inflation expectations are perfectly anchored. In reality, however, the anchoring of inflation expectations has been a hard-won achievement of monetary policy over the past few decades. Now, my short summary of that is that Cohn, plausibly, was worried about inflation expectations spinning out of control, and
On the downside.
and in either direction, and that was a reflection of his perception that the central bank, the Fed, was imperfectly credible in the eyes of the public. And so then the question becomes, how do we change what we say if that's the world we think we're in?
All right. We'll go with Bill Poole, and then that'll probably have to be, and then Athanasius. Yeah, go to Bill. One sentence. Shorten them up. Shorten up the questions. More pitch, less wind up. Everybody, more pitch, less wind up.
Over the past 30 years or so, the whole communication process has been flipped upside down, essentially, and there's been tremendous progress made in the Fed conveying information about its intentions and what it's doing. It seems to me that what we now need is some careful analysis from the side of the market. What information does the market need out of the Fed? What information does the market need? If we look at it that way, it may change the way we want to think about the Fed's communication strategy.
Thank you. Last one, Athanasius. Everybody's got something?
Thank you. It's an excellent discussion. Just one sentence add-on to what Mickey mentioned. Since the issue of how to communicate uncertainty came up in the current instance is an important one, the other thing that could be done would be to present risk scenarios. So one of the things that the committee has access to, because they're part of the Teal book, they used to be part of the Blue book, is risk scenarios that for those of us who are reading historical documents actually give the best explanations for some of the policy moves that are otherwise difficult to explain. Since they are already in the Teal book, why not make a version of the same scenarios available to the public as part of the SEP?
All right. I'm going to go with you first, Loretta. I think you're the one with the hardest time constraint. I'm willing to move off that if you want.
Yeah. So, David, I'm not. There's a lot of scenarios that you could play out. Your one is one of them. But when we come into the room, that's where we have those discussions about what we're seeing out in the environment in terms of the economic environment and what policy tools we're going to bring to bear. I do think the committee will be looking at various scenarios, perhaps one of the ones you're thinking, but there are other scenarios out there as well, and that's this kind of discussion that we have at the meetings where we come together and try to reach a consensus. On the other, the idea of scenarios in an environment like this kind of has some salience for me, like thinking about the future, but that's, I think, an internal discussion, and then the question is, what do you want to convey in terms of the narrative to the public? And that, I think, takes some real thought, because you're not sure, right, what the reaction would be to those scenarios. You could get information, and we talked about this, I was used to be on the subcommittee on communications when we were doing all that work, and Andy, you were part of the 2012 work. There was discussions about, can we have sort of distributions of risk? What we ended up in the SEP, there are charts in there that talk about, right, are the risks on the downside or upside. As you know, in the statement, they used to actually talk about that balance, whether there's biases one way or the other. I think that kind of communication can be helpful because risks have become a very important part of kind of the policy process. And thinking about the right way of doing that, I think, is important for us to do. I can't tell you today what the right way to do it is. My suggestion is an easy one, which is we already have some information on uncertainty and risk, right, in the SEP. We can move those up so that we're giving some context around it. But I think in this case, words are your friend. I mean, talking more in a statement that the committee votes on, I can't believe can be a bad thing in this kind of environment.
Don?
Though you do have to, I think the challenge will be getting the committee to agree on the statement and the scenarios. So it's very different, Athanasios, as you know, what's in the green book and what's or teal book or whatever color it is these days isn't the committees, it's the staffs. And then you'd have to get 12 Reserve Bank presidents to buy in, as well as seven board members to buy in to using those scenarios. So it's a lot of experience. Right. So I think it's a good idea, the scenario analysis, but I'm not sure how easily to execute. But I would say it's a great thing for people giving speeches. So I always looked at my speeches, with the exception of that one, as really talking about the risk to the right side of the Taylor rule. So I never talked about what I thought I should do with interest rates. There weren't dot plots then. Even if there had been a dot plot, I don't think I would do that. I would talk about the risk to inflation and the risk to output and let people infer where I thought, we're lucky to get whether they're going to go up or down or stay even. In 2018, the presidents were arguing in public about would it be 2 increases, 3 increases, 1 increase. This is excessive confidence, I think, in our ability to get that stuff right. And I think our credibility and communication.
Somebody else has confidence in our abilities. Is that what you mean?
I agree with. Fortunately, I agree with what I said. I was relieved. But I think the credibility helps you have flexibility. This is Marvin's point, right? If you can have a credible target, you were you could be more flexible in your move against unemployment, for example. And so I think I think the FOMC's gone a long way, and they have structured the current discussion around kind of what you're saying, what exactly you were saying. How can we make it even more credible? How can we build that credibility to make sure it doesn't sink below 2? Marvin was mostly worried about the upside, but sink below 2. So I think the Fed is wrestling with exactly the issue you raised. What can we communicate? What's our strategy to fix it at 2, and then how can we communicate that effectively? And that will give us more flexibility.
So I'm going to go to Charlie Evans. I'll tell Charlie Calmeres the question. I'll ask Charlie to answer Bill Poole's question, because I think that's exactly where your sweet spot
Sorry, I
is.
don't have that one. I wanted to go.
No, different Charlie Seaton, not Charlie E. Sorry, I'm working on this.
Go right ahead.
Don't you want him to go first?
Yeah, you go first, Charlie, and then
You go
Charlie
first.
Evans. President
You ask
Evans,
him
you go
whatever you
first.
want.
Charlie will follow up.
He just gave me an assignment.
Got it,
He's
got it,
not
got it.
going to give
Sorry.
you one.
Not going to give you one.
I wanted to, Dave Zervos brought 2 more elephants to the room, I thought. So it kind of feels like, it's the old story about, we've lost our keys, there's a lamppost, we're looking under the lamppost because at least there's some light. And, that's what this conference is. You've got some Fed presidents here. People are asking, what's going on. And what you described was growing risk to public health and safety that needs to be addressed by, the leadership in public health and safety and providing confidence there. What monetary policy will do is look at what these risks, mean for the path of the economy and us achieving our maximum employment and price stability goal, and doing what, is needed in order to get us on track. I think we've got a playbook that, it's unusual relative to the last 20 years, but it has been regularly reviewed, and we've talked about it a lot in the Fed Listens context, and I think the kinds of things that we could do are not unknown to people in this room and in the public. And so I think that path forward is not that unclear, but we just don't know what the state is. We'll be responding to that. I do think that in most of the cases, the most effective tools would be, getting some type of liquidity and funds in the hands of people who need it most. There will be perhaps times when people aren't allowed to go to work for a couple of weeks or a month, and they're probably lower income wage individuals who aren't paid for that. And if there were a way to provide income to them, after all, the consumer's been very strong in this recovery, and so maintaining that has the greater hope of maintaining the recovery and expansion going forward. Some insightful policies like that, collective, we're part of a team, and I think that's just really important.
Yeah. So I loved Bill Poole's question. It's really the implicit question that my presentation was really trying to address. And so I don't know all the answers to the question of what can the Fed do that's helpful to the markets in terms of communication. But I can say one thing I think would be, which is if they could do things that help the market converge faster to prices it was going to get to eventually. So that's one answer to your question, and that was the answer I was focusing on. So what are the 3 things that would get you there? One would be to adopt the kind of strategy that Mickey was talking about, which I think is fully consistent with Don Cohn's point about risk, and was also consistent with the other presentations here. That is, a communication about risk is helpful. Secondly, incorporate data science to improve the Fed's own understanding of the economy. The Fed is forecastably making lots of errors. It is very delayed in its understanding of the current state of the economy unnecessarily. So no matter how good its strategy is, it's lagging unnecessarily. And third, there is some evidence, as I mentioned from Steve Sharp's paper, that the Fed may be institutionally reluctant to change its views as quickly as circumstances warrant. And there are different ways to understand why that is. But so I think thinking internally about ways to make the Fed communication to the market able to get to the right answer faster has all 3 of those pieces.
Okay, everyone, we're slightly beyond schedule, but I do appreciate this exceptional conversation about things that mattered so much to Marvin. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.